Today we have two guests, Adrian Goldner, visual artist, and Francisco Marin, biologist. And the conversation that we would like to have is in relation to the 22nd of April, International Earth Day. The topic that we want to address is the importance of the awareness of our ecosystem and why it's important to know what's going on with the flora and fauna in urban settings.
Thank you, Guillermo. Yeah, I think I have to back it up a little bit because it's sort of not obvious in my case. I began the project when one day I saw on a porch of a house in the neighborhood a house finch and a European starling, and both of these birds had been imported here and didn't exist here 150 years ago. And it starts to make me think about how we humans, in fact, affect the environment that we're in. So I then just had the idea, what if I counted every single bird I saw and start to sort of tabulate, make visual that data. And that might be begin to tell me over time what changes in the environment are going on. Difficult, it's pretty idiosyncratic material, but the actual act of doing it, tracking it, making it visual is demonstrative in itself. And it brings others to look at and be better stewards of the environment. At least that's what I hope.
Well, my name is Francisco Yucamarán. I'm originally from Mexico, from the Yucatan Peninsula. I am a biologist. I have a master's and PhD in toxicology, working with wildlife in many other countries, including Norway, Iceland, and Canada. My main research approach has been using birds as a biomonitors for trends that are happening in the north, and also to see what changes are between behavior in some of the species relating to being exposed to these contaminants. As you know, birds are not living all the time at the same place. They travel a lot. So it's easy to make a trend and to see the pattern of exposure from different places that they migrate. So that's part of my research. So as a kid, I was very fascinated seeing birds from Canada going to Yucatan, and eventually I was lucky enough to work in Canada, seeing these birds in their own environment here, and also even beyond in the Arctic area.
I think in part for my project, I am aware that, of course, in the urban environment, as Francisco observes, that there's a great deal of pollution and all, and I suppose I haven't been sampling that, but I guess our awareness of the urban environment overlays on the data I collect, and we are living in sort of like times in which we're sort of hyper aware of ideas of global climate change. So whatever I do is it sort of informs on that already sort of consciousness that people are bringing to it. So it, much of what I do is sort of pseudoscientific, as opposed to actually being science. In that the information that I have is actually regimented day by day, list by list, bird by bird, and when one looks upon the result, one sees pattern, one sees change, and most of that is by yearly cycles of migration and such. But given our disposition to be concerned about the environment, we begin to read into it. That's what our brains do. So I think maybe perhaps again using scientific or pseudoscientific means in my own case, it brings legitimacy to what is again something wrought with the variables, but indeed in its own terms pretty concise.
No, I agree. I think everybody, even I appreciate a lot of information, for example, from farmers. They have day-to-day living with different cycles, and they have been observing the last 10, 20 years so many changes, not only in the change in the climate, in the environment, but also how the urban areas being extending, and they're having so many changes in that. Well, in their own perception of that. So I was mentioning yesterday to Guillermo that one of the things that going on with me when I was a teenager to go to school is that I noticed in the south part of Mexico there is a lot of tomato crops, and birds who were feeding from dead insects were doing their nests way lower than the rest of the other birds, and that's because they couldn't fly as high anymore. They pretty much glide, and they were just like a jumping and gliding. But even like that, they were preparing their nest and everything. But it was an observation very interesting at the time with a pesticide called diazinon. Um, so for me, that's what one of the reasons to go into biology and toxicology, used to see so much of the behavior being changed regarding the exposure to not only to the change in the climate, as I mentioned, but also exposed to different pesticides. And in my mind at the time, I was thinking, if animals are changing their behavior, maybe humans are doing it too. So that's one of the questions that pretty much inspired me to continue a scientific career. But during that time, I met so many different people, activists, farmers, artists, so many people who are raising awareness about what's going on, and they have their own point of view, which is very interesting because sometimes, as a scientist, we don't have that perception or that opportunity to see it, and sometimes we use too much hard data instead of seeing some of the behavioral occurrences around. So that's what I appreciate this invitation, and I appreciate that Guillermo is doing this, because this will pretty much enrich our different point of views, and we have a common goal, which is very to make a better, honestly, a better ecosystem for everyone around here.
My hyper awareness, which, as I said, is sort of a demonstrative gesture. You know, I have thought I've noticed things. Now, whether it's just coincidental or these, yearly patterns are much larger than I observed, but I thought, the years that there were more starlings, there were less robins, and starlings are marauders. And they really do dominate a neighborhood. But I've also learned that robins are not slouches either. If there's ever a mobbing of a hawk or an owl, the robins are in the thick of it. So yeah, and more curious things. Like one day, starlings are smart birds and they're mimics. And one day I heard a starling mimicking a ring-billed gull. And it was like, wow, ring-billed gull is a fairly recent arrival in our area here, and they're everywhere, and they're scavengers, and to have, this sort of coincidence of newly arrived birds, both of which have settled into the urban core, having this sort of odd dialogue, again speaks to the way in which some birds thrive in this new environment. Other ones are sort of vanquished from it.
No, I agree, and also we change our behavior regarding our how much we consume from different variations of fruits, for example, or different source of proteins. So if we change, for example, if we need more avocados from Mexico to Canada as a demand, we're pretty much moving all that species to another place because we're increasing our area of farming for these avocados. And that happens in Brazil, for example, with soya beans. And it happens in so many different places in the world regarding the demands of agriculture. So we see not only a change in the climate change, in the environment per se, in the temperature, but also these lands being more available or not for different crops and different use of the land. And that change also how the migration and some of the species are moving around. In my case, I've been working a lot with mostly the Arctic. And as you know, the Arctic is melting at a very high rate these days. But also birds, especially glaucous gulls and herring gulls in the north, they are pretty much the hyenas of the Arctic because they will eat a polar bear, which is a apex carnivorous animal, and they will transfer all that information of contaminants into an egg. So that's why for scientists it's very useful use an egg as a bio marker of what's going on there. And then we can find very fantastic and scary things. Like, for example, we can find DDT who was used 5 years ago when DDT is being banned supposedly since the 70s. And so this show you how much things are going on in the world, and either by the grasshopper effect or by direct exposure, these animals are getting contaminated. And that's, for example, one of the change in the behaviors that some of them have, also in the patterns of migration.
I expect, like my experience is very different than yours. You have these specific cases of the direct relationship between, pesticides and chemicals and the food chain. I don't have any of that. So I simply have the observation and the visual results upon which people respond. And the first exhibition of this series, All the Birds I Saw Last Year, people responded, very positively. And as much as there was an environmental one, it wasn't an obvious one. It wasn't browbeating. It wasn't trying to scare them. In fact, it was trying to instruct through being positive, right? An inversion in which we were shown to live in a natural environment as opposed to the natural environment, being in us. And people found it was pleasantly overwhelming to see a single view of someone's bird experience or avian experience in a single exhibition. And again, people can walk away with that feeling sort of positive or excited. I don't want them to forget about the environmental dangers or what is occurring, but make them aware of perhaps what we have to lose.
No, I totally agree. I think and that's where so many other actors regarding delivering the message are important, because sometimes as a scientist we get lost in scientific conferences and so many other peer review papers, then we forget that it's necessary to transfer this knowledge as we know it. As any other are coming in, we can assemble this puzzle of anything that's going on in the changes in the environment. But we need people who really can communicate, and that's something, for example, that is very hard for scientists and researchers to do. I think that's where other segment of the community comes along, and they are very aware and they experience this day-to-day communication with the community. But I think the effort of everyone together is something that can make a change. We've seen it in so many other countries and other cultures. Working together, they can really change and actually diminish the impact and also shift some of the trends that we believe sometimes is irreversible. But they are, if we have enough people conscious about what they're doing and the choices and the way of living.
Yeah, I had the thought that I once heard that, when people started talking about climate change and how it's going to really affect our world, is that they sold it poorly. They just showed the detrimental effects, as opposed to what a new green world with electricity, as opposed to huge amounts of carbon and methane, creating greenhouse effects, etc. And I think one of the things that I think the art's able to do is to say it positively and to reinforce, what we have to lose. I know in these last couple of years in COVID, how people have taken to bird watching. Huge numbers. People are e-birding. They're sending in all their stats. They're very involved, and that must sort of shake down to their children and other people, environmental awareness, positivity. So, as much as we need to, be aware of the threats, I think we also have to proceed with an optimistic outlook, the one that says, you can do something, you can be aware, and that awareness hopefully leads to action, which of course needs to be done.
Well, it's true. Like the pandemics was an experiment, pretty much, if you want to see it, removing humans from regular so many ecosystems. And just for example, if you see the Mediterranean Sea, they haven't seen a whale in more than 100 years, almost 150 years. When you remove all the cruise ships and all the noise going on by maritime activities, you have a natural resilience going down and pretty much going back in time when these places were fulfilled with amazing biodiversity. And that happens in so many other places. I'm just making an example because it's very clear about the cruise ships and the boats. But if you remove that, we can see it in so many videos that in places in Spain, there were wild animals running in the night in the middle of the street. And that happened in so many places in the world. So you can see how much humans have this impact, not only establishing themselves inside the ecosystem, but also all the activities, including the noises, the lights, and other things that disrupt pretty much some of the activities there. So this was, and we are pretty much fresh of this experience, seeing all this wildlife going back to reclaim some of the places that they used to be all the time.
Yeah, I noticed that immediately during the first wave. Of course, they cut out they locked the dog parks here locally. You could walk through a park, but you couldn't stay in it. And a raven took possession of a child's sort of play structure. For the very first time, I saw a brown creeper in the park. There was a merlin for the first time. It got quiet, and then very soon nature reasserted itself because they could.
And that shows how easily some of the comeback can happen in nature. So we saw it that dramatically, for example, in Chernobyl or some other places.
Yes.
But going local around here, I was lucky enough to see a bald eagle in Wakefield, and you can see how everything was reclaiming and going back to some of the wonderful ecosystems that we have, talking about birds.
Mm-hmm. I was actually I was thinking about Chernobyl, and I've been looking at the Korean DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and it's this 250 kilometer, 4 kilometer wide strip, and it's got species. It's been untouched for 70 years, and it's this eco-rich thing that you can't go into because of the landmines and and such.
Yeah.
But apparently it's this super diverse ecosystem, and the only place in Korea there might be tigers and things. So if we can manage to leave them alone, they will thrive, they will do well.
Yeah, well, we have so many examples of these things going on in different parts of the world that you will think we will approach logically and use these examples to pretty much to try to manage our biodiversity. But sadly, there is a lot of other things going on, like industrial and political projects that sometimes don't always allow us to do those things. And I think this conversation regarding birds specifically is something very interesting because I've been fascinated by avian species all my life. I seen them migrating from Canada to Mexico since I was a kid, and especially all the ducks who go to the Yucatan swamps and wetlands. But it is a fantastic way to express how we don't belong to a specific site, but we move around and we use so many different ecosystems and even countries used to exist as a species. So I think that's one of the, I don't know, one of the lessons I got from studying this for a few years. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, I've come to birding, well, relatively late. I've been sort of like a gaining in knowledge, and with this project, I think looking at every bird for 3 years hardened me into a pretty good birder, and I have people who advise me, and I see the benefit, and you see the benefit, and yes, if we can bring other people, like the birds, yeah, the canary in the coal mine, quite literally, for the environment. If somehow we can sort of take their experience of their neighborhood birds to be a constant reminder of our stewardship of nature in our neighborhoods, then we gain tremendously. But yes, as you say, there's other things going on. There's industry, there's politics, and it's always compromise when both of us feel the urgency to make sure that they are protected, because they're also they pollinate, and they serve lots of functions, spreading seeds and you name it. But not too many people are perhaps as aware as we are. I guess that's our function.
Well, also, every species has their own value in their activities into the ecosystems. It's recently, until the 10, 20 years, that people discover that not only bees are pollinators, for example. There are species, for example, in Mexico as bats, who are very specific for tequila agave. And that's because the industry found them, that those are the responsible, not the bees, not the ants, not any other thing. And that happens also with birds. Birds have a very specific activities into the ecosystem that is not that we're going to lose, for example, a hummingbird. We're going to lose an entire set of plants if something like that happens. So that's the importance, to make people aware of what's important really in this ecosystem. And it's very hard for humans or machines at this point to mimetize that.
Yeah. If I look at my, back away from my project, to use a very old term, augury, where one, looks to the birds to portend the future. I bring, despite, the sort of the scientific method, or at least the thoroughness of how I approached it, this idea that one can extrapolate from one's own observations, citizen science, is something of worth. And if I can help to sort of promote that sort of awareness or hyper awareness of the environment, all the better. And yeah, if there's opportunity, as we are doing right now, for people like ourselves to couple our thinking and to reinforce both the science through art and the art through the science, then well, all the better.
Well, I think our time is running out, but I think if we go back even in time, we can see something of the folklore and also something of the Mesoamerican civilization regarding quetzals and some other birds who were very important. We can see the observation for people in pre-Hispanic world, for example, and the appreciation for some of these magnificent creatures who were providing a very specific part in the ecosystem, as do any other animals. No, I think the combination between science, art, and communicating these things, and in open spaces, and celebrating like this April 22nd event will bring together because we're pretty much doing the same effort from different fronts. And I think that's people need to know and to be aware of some of these events, some of the efforts, and they can join to any when they feel more comfortable to do so.
Yeah. All the time sort of evading or trying not to fall into sort of false hope. You remember when the scientists at Cornell thought they'd rediscovered the ivory-billed woodpecker. It was, the holy grail. Somehow it stood for if we could save this bird that has been discovered, then somehow we have, hope for saving other elements of our ecosystem. And try as they might, they couldn't find it, nor could they find it in subsequent missions in Cuba. So we know there's lots of damage already done. Whether we can sort of push back, and but that's difficult. Our population continues to increase. So as humans, and we tend to make a larger and larger footprint. In Ottawa here, where we're fairly environmentally conscious and well educated, the suburbs continue to sprawl, and they sprawl into farmlands, and they're about to, put a corridor through the green belt and through, Mare Blue Bog towards Orleans. So, I mean, it's just like, do as you might. We still are living in a world in which we continue to make a larger and larger footprint.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's one of the situations that we have in cities expanding around, because the easiest way to expand is on farmland. And we can see in the past, I don't know, a decade, how Ottawa went from one place to the airport with Barhaven and all the other places going and still keep growing. And it's farmland that we're using, and so many species and so many other resources as agriculture are being pretty much trapped in between the development of the cities.
Adrian and Francisco, I think that was a pretty interesting conversation. I really like the way that we try to join the importance of using arts to visualize all of these problems, and the importance to have communication. And like you say, Francisco, sometimes the science have to not just think in the hard data, but also think about the observation, and artists are incredible people to show us sometimes what is not obvious to the people, right? I really appreciate your participation in this talk. It's the first talk that we try to do this combination between science and arts, and I hope you have a good time having this conversation.
Thanks to UNAM-Canadá for the invitation. Thank you so much for Adrian to join and talk with me and to share these ideas. My only complaint is I think the time was too short, but besides that, I think we pretty much can talk all day long about projects and birds. But I appreciate the effort that you guys are doing through the university. I really think it's a good, it's a very good way to contribute, especially in these topics.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate the invitation as well, and yeah, I like the talks where I'm not just talking with another artist. That necessarily we have to talk to other practices and disciplines, and indeed, yeah, we're excited by birds just on a personal level, and that's where it all extends from, and yeah, hopefully that personal interest can be extended to being, well, policy and protection of our avian friends.